The blood-soaked bandage around Theodore Murray's arm did nothing to mask the severity of his wound as he staggered through the doorway of Dr. Winters' office in Copper Creek, Colorado. Outside, the December wind of 1873 howled with the promise of the season's first blizzard, while inside, Tabitha Winters looked up from her medical journal with alarm spreading across her features. "What on earth happened to you, Mr. Murray?" she asked, immediately setting aside her notes and rushing to help the older man to the examination table. "Caught myself on a rusty nail while mending the barn," Theodore grimaced, his weathered face paling as she began to unwrap the crude dressing. "Didn't think much of it until this morning when I couldn't bend my arm without wanting to holler." Tabitha's trained eyes recognized the angry red streaks extending from the wound immediately. At 26, she had been assisting her father with his medical practice since she was 16 and had taken over completely when he passed 2 years prior. Some folks in town still questioned a woman doctor, but most had come to respect her knowledge and skill. "This is infected, Mr. Murray." "Badly." She pressed gently around the wound, noting his sharp intake of breath. "And I'm concerned about the spread of the infection. You're going to need more than just cleaning and bandaging." Outside, the first heavy snowflakes began to fall, dancing past the frosted windows of the small medical office. Tabitha glanced worriedly at the darkening sky before turning back to her patient. "I need to give you quinine and some stronger medicine to fight this infection, but I'm afraid I've run out. The supply wagon was due yesterday but hasn't arrived." She bit her lower lip. "With this storm coming in, I doubt it will make it before the pass closes." Theodore's wife, Martha, who had been quietly sitting in the corner, spoke up. "What happens if he doesn't get the medicine, Dr. Winters?" Tabitha hesitated, unwilling to frighten them unnecessarily, but knowing honesty was required. "The infection could spread to his blood, if that happens." She didn't finish the sentence. "I'll clean this thoroughly and give you what I have for the pain, but someone needs to ride to Silverton. Dr. Abernathy there will have what we need." Martha's face fell. "Silverton? But that's nearly 30 miles through the mountains." "And with the storm coming, I know," Tabitha interrupted gently. "But I don't see another option. Mr. Murray needs that medicine within the next day, or I cannot guarantee what will happen." As if summoned by their desperate conversation, the door to the clinic swung open, bringing with it a swirl of snowflakes and a tall figure in a long duster and wide-brimmed hat. Knox Blackwood stood in the doorway, snow dusting his broad shoulders, his presence commanding attention without a word spoken. Tabitha felt a flutter of something in her chest irritation. She told herself firmly. Knox had arrived in Copper Creek only 3 months ago, taking work at the Peterson Ranch. The man was insufferably confident, with a reputation for being both skilled with horses and quick with his gun when necessary. He kept to himself mostly, but when their paths crossed, he seemed to delight in getting under her skin with his laconic remarks and knowing glances. "Pardon the interruption," he said, his voice deep and smooth like aged whiskey. "Came to pick up something for Peterson's gout." "Mr. Blackwood," Tabitha acknowledged stiffly. "I'll be with you shortly. I'm dealing with an urgent matter." Knox's gaze shifted to Theodore, taking in the infected wound and the man's ashen complexion with a quick, assessing glance. He stepped further into the room, closing the door against the increasing snowfall. "Looks bad," he observed simply. "It is," Tabitha replied. "Mr. Murray needs medicine from Silverton, but with the storm." She gestured toward the window where the snow was now falling heavily. Knox moved to the window, studying the sky with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years reading the weather. "Storm's going to get worse before it gets better. Pass will be dangerous." "I'm well aware," Tabitha said tersely. "But without that medicine, Mr. Murray could lose his arm. Or worse." Knox turned his piercing blue eyes on her. "What medicine?" "Quinine, primarily. And I need silver nitrate for the wound itself. Dr. Abernathy and Silverton will have both." There was a moment of silence as Knox seemed to consider something. Then, with a slight nod, he said, "I'll go." Tabitha blinked in surprise. "You? But the storm, I've ridden through worse." He shrugged as if offering to ride 30 miles through a blizzard was no more significant than offering to fetch water from a well. "Mr. Blackwood, I appreciate the offer, but it's too dangerous. The temperature is dropping by the hour and the pass. Do you have another solution, Dr. Winters?" Knox interrupted, his gaze steady on hers. Tabitha faltered. She didn't have another solution. The town's sheriff was away, the stagecoach driver wouldn't attempt the mountain pass in this weather, and few others in town had the skill or fortitude to make such a journey. "No," she admitted reluctantly, "but I cannot ask you to risk your life." "You're not asking. I'm offering." Knox turned to Theodore and Martha. "Don't worry, I'll be back with that medicine before you know it." Martha clutched her husband's hand, tears of gratitude shining in her eyes. "God bless you, Mr. Blackwood." Knox merely nodded, uncomfortable with the woman's emotion. He turned back to Tabitha. "Write down exactly what you need. I'll leave within the hour." Tabitha studied him for a moment, trying to discern his motivation. They were hardly friends, barely acquaintances, really, and yet here he was, volunteering for what could very well be a suicide mission. "Why would you do this?" she asked quietly. A shadow of something amusement, perhaps, or something deeper crossed his face. "Maybe I'm just the heroic type, Dr. Winters." Despite the gravity of the situation, Tabitha nearly rolled her eyes. "I'm serious, Mr. Blackwood." His expression sobered. "So am I. A man needs help. I can provide it. It's that simple." But Tabitha sensed there was nothing simple about Knox Blackwood. Still, she had no choice but to accept his offer. She quickly wrote down the medicines needed and handed him the note. "Be careful," she said, surprised by the genuine concern in her voice. Knox tucked the note into his coat pocket. "Always am, Doc." With a tip of his hat, he was gone, the door closing behind him as the howling wind momentarily invaded the warm office. Tabitha turned back to Theodore, trying to ignore the knot of worry forming in her stomach. "Let's clean that wound properly, Mr. Murray, and then we'll pray Mr. Blackwood is as good as his word." Knox Blackwood stood in the livery stable, carefully checking the cinch on his saddle. His gelding, Midnight, a powerful black stallion with a white blaze down his face, snorted and stomped, sensing the coming journey. "Easy, boy," Knox murmured, running a gloved hand down the horse's neck. "We've got a long ride ahead." "You're a damn fool, Blackwood," came a gruff voice from behind him. Knox didn't turn around, recognizing the voice of Hank Wilson, the livery owner. "Probably," he agreed, continuing his preparations. "No probably about it." Hank moved closer, his limp more pronounced in the cold weather. "Nobody in their right mind would attempt the pass in this weather, not even you. Murray needs medicine. And what good will that medicine do if you freeze to death trying to fetch it?" Hank shook his head. "There are other ways." "We could wait for the storm to pass. Murray doesn't have that kind of time," Knox interrupted, finally turning to face the older man. "You know that as well as I do." Hank's weathered face creased with concern. "I've seen men die in storms like this. Good men, experienced men." "I appreciate the concern," Knox said, his tone softening slightly, "but my mind's made up." Hank studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Wait here." He disappeared into the back of the stable, returning moments later with a heavy oilskin coat and a flask. "Take these. Coat's better protection than that duster and the whiskey." He shrugged. Well, it might not keep you warm, but it'll make you think you are. Knox accepted both with a nod of thanks. I'll bring them back. See that you do, Hank said gruffly. And bring yourself back too, you stubborn mule. A rare smile touched Knox's lips. Yes, sir. He donned the heavier coat, secured his saddlebags, and led Midnight out of the stable. The snow was falling steadily now, already accumulating on the ground, and the wind cut through the town like a knife. Knox mounted up and turned Midnight toward the edge of town, passing the doctor's office on his way. Through the window, he caught a glimpse of Tabitha Winters, her chestnut hair glowing in the lamplight as she bent over her patient. Something tugged at him, an unfamiliar feeling he couldn't quite name. He pushed it aside, focusing instead on the journey ahead. As he urged Midnight forward, the snow swirling around them, Knox couldn't help but wonder what had possessed him to volunteer for this mission. He told himself it was simple human decency. A man needed help, and he could provide it. But a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that perhaps it had something to do with the look of desperate concern in Tabitha Winters' green eyes. Whatever the reason, he was committed now. Knox pulled his hat lower against the driving snow and pointed Midnight toward the mountain pass, the first leg of their treacherous journey to Silverton. Tabitha finished cleaning Theodore's wound, applying a poultice of yarrow and garlic that would help draw out some of the infection. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough, but it was all she could do until Knox returned with the proper medicine. If he returned, the thought sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the frigid air seeping through the clinic's windows. Why should she care so much about the fate of a man she barely knew? A man who, on the few occasions they'd interacted, had managed to aggravate her with his laconic responses and knowing smirks. "You've gone awful quiet, Dr. Winters," Martha said softly, interrupting Tabitha's thoughts. "Do you think Mr. Blackwood will make it?" Tabitha forced a reassuring smile. "Mr. Blackwood strikes me as a man who accomplishes what he sets out to do, Mrs. Murray, and the storm may not be as bad as we fear." But even as she spoke the words, a violent gust of wind rattled the windows, making a mockery of her optimism. "He's a good man," Theodore said weakly from the examination table. "Seen him around town, keeps to himself, but always ready to lend a hand when needed." Tabitha raised an eyebrow. That didn't match the image she had formed of Knox Blackwood, the mysterious, somewhat arrogant cowboy who seemed to wear his isolation like a second skin. "I didn't realize you knew him well," she said, curious despite herself. "Don't know him well at all," Theodore admitted, "but I've watched him. Man's actions speak louder than his words, and he don't say much." A ghost of a smile crossed his pain-lined face. Tabitha finished bandaging the wound and helped Theodore sit up. "I want you to stay here tonight, Mr. Murray. I'll make up a cot in the back room. It's too dangerous for you to go home in this weather, and I need to keep an eye on that infection." Martha nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Doctor. I'll stay with him." As Tabitha prepared the back room, her thoughts returned to Knox Blackwood, riding alone into the storm. She found herself sending up a silent prayer for his safety, not just for Theodore's sake, but for reasons she wasn't ready to examine too closely. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing Copper Creek in white and erasing all traces of the lone rider who had departed an hour before. The wind howled like a wounded animal as Knox urged Midnight forward through the deepening snow. They had made good progress for the first few hours, following the trail that wound through the foothills before beginning the steep climb toward Mason's Pass. But as darkness fell, the storm intensified, turning what was already a dangerous journey into something that bordered on madness. Knox could barely see 10 feet ahead, the swirling snow creating a disorienting white void that seemed to swallow the world. The temperature had plummeted, and despite the heavy coat Hank had provided, The cold had seeped into his bones, numbing his fingers and toes. "Just keep moving, boy," he murmured to Midnight, who trudged valiantly forward, head lowered against the driving snow. "We'll find shelter soon." Knox knew these mountains well enough to know that there was an old line shack about halfway to the pass, a crude shelter used by cowboys and trappers caught in the high country. If his calculations were correct, they should be nearing it now. But in this blizzard, with all landmarks obscured, he was relying more on instinct than knowledge. A particularly violent gust of wind nearly unseated him, and Knox tightened his grip on the reins, leaning forward to shield Midnight's neck from the worst of the elements. The horse snorted, steam rising from his nostrils, but continued to push forward. Just when Knox was beginning to fear they had somehow missed the shack, a dark shape materialized through the curtain of white. Relief washed over him as he recognized the outline of the small cabin. "There it is, boy," he said, patting Midnight's neck with a gloved hand. "Just a little further." They reached the shack, and Knox dismounted stiffly, his legs nearly buckling beneath him from cold and fatigue. He led Midnight to the lean-to attached to the side of the cabin. It wasn't much, but it would provide some shelter from the wind. "Sorry it's not better accommodations," he told the horse, removing the saddle and rubbing him down with handfuls of straw he found in the corner. He made sure Midnight had access to the small stream that ran nearby, partially frozen now, but still flowing enough for the horse to drink, before turning his attention to the shack itself. The door was stiff with ice but yielded to his shoulder. Inside, it was dark and cold, but blessedly free from the howling wind. Knox fumbled with a match, lighting a small lantern that hung from a hook in the ceiling. The weak light revealed a sparse interior. A small iron stove, a rough-hewn table with a single chair, and a narrow cot pushed against one wall. Knox set to work immediately, building a fire in the stove with the meager supply of wood stacked beside it. His fingers were so numb he could barely grip the matches, but eventually the fire caught, sending a welcome warmth through the small space. As feeling painfully returned to his extremities, Knox shed his frozen outer layers and hung them near the stove to dry. He checked his pocket watch. Nearly 9 o'clock. They had been traveling for almost 6 hours, and he estimated they were roughly halfway to Silverton. If the storm abated by morning, they might still make it in time. Knox pulled out Hank's flask and took a long swallow, the whiskey burning a path down his throat and spreading warmth through his chest. As he sat on the edge of the cot, his thoughts turned unexpectedly to Tabitha Winters. He had first noticed her 3 months ago, shortly after arriving in Copper Creek. He had cut his hand breaking up a fight at the saloon, and someone had suggested he see the doctor. He had been surprised to find a young woman in the doctor's office, even more surprised when she had efficiently cleaned and stitched his wound without so much as a flinch at the sight of blood. "You're new in town," she had said, not looking up from her work. "That obvious," he had replied. "Copper Creek isn't large, Mr. Blackwood. Knox Blackwood, Mr. Blackwood." She had finished the last stitch and finally looked up at him, her green eyes direct and unafraid. "I'm Dr. Tabitha Winters, and yes, before you ask, I am a real doctor. I trained under my father for 10 years before he passed." Knox had raised an eyebrow. "Wasn't going to question it, Doc. Your stitching speaks for itself." She had seemed momentarily taken aback by his acceptance, and Knox had found himself intrigued by the flash of surprise in her eyes. Since then, their paths had crossed occasionally in town, and each time he had felt a pull toward her that he couldn't quite explain and didn't particularly welcome. Knox had learned long ago that attachments were dangerous things. They made a man vulnerable, gave him something to lose. Better to keep moving to avoid putting down roots that would only be torn up eventually. And yet, here he was, risking his neck in a blizzard to fetch medicine for one of her patients. "You're a damn fool, Blackwood," he muttered, echoing Hank's earlier assessment. Outside, the wind continued to howl, and Knox knew the storm was far from over. He would need to rest while he could. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. He stretched out on the narrow cot. His last thoughts before drifting into an exhausted sleep were of green eyes filled with concern and a voice asking, "Why would you do this?" He still wasn't sure he had an answer. Tabitha sat beside Theodore's bed, watching the rise and fall of his chest as he slept fitfully. The poultice had helped reduce some of the redness around the wound, but the infection was still spreading, evidenced by the heat radiating from his skin and the fever that had developed over the past few hours. Martha had finally succumbed to exhaustion and was dozing in a chair on the other side of the bed. The small coal stove in the corner provided just enough heat to keep the room comfortable, despite the frigid air that seeped through every crack and crevice of the old building. Outside, the storm raged unabated. Tabitha moved to the window, wiping away the frost to peer out at the snow-covered street. The town was eerily silent, all its residents wisely taking shelter from the blizzard. All except one. Knox Blackwood was out there somewhere, fighting his way through that howling void. The thought sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. Why did he volunteer? The question had been haunting her all evening. They were barely acquaintances, and what little interaction they'd had could hardly be called friendly. She had always found him aggravating, too confident, too laconic, too. Something she couldn't quite define. And yet, when Theodore needed help, Knox had stepped forward without hesitation, offering to risk his life on a journey that most men wouldn't attempt even in good weather. "Maybe I'm just the heroic type," he had said. But Tabitha had seen something in his eyes that belied the flippant response, a depth and complexity that she had not previously attributed to the stoic cowboy. A soft moan from Theodore pulled her from her thoughts. She returned to his bedside, checking his temperature with the back of her hand against his forehead. "Still too warm," she murmured, reaching for the basin of cool water on the nightstand. She wrung out a cloth and placed it gently on his forehead. "How is he?" Martha asked, her eyes fluttering open. "The fever hasn't broken yet," Tabitha replied honestly. "But he's strong, Mrs. Murray, and the poultice is helping to draw out some of the infection." Martha nodded, her lined face etched with worry. "And Mr. Blackwood, do you think?" Tabitha hesitated. "I believe he will do everything in his power to return with the medicine. But will it be enough?" Martha's voice was barely a whisper. Tabitha had no answer to that. Instead, she adjusted Theodore's blankets and checked his bandage. "Try to get some more rest, Mrs. Murray. I'll wake you if there's any change." Once Martha had drifted back to sleep, Tabitha moved to her desk in the corner of the room. She opened her journal, intending to make notes on Theodore's condition, but found herself staring at the blank page, her mind elsewhere. Her thoughts returned to Knox, imagining him out in the storm, battling the elements for a man he barely knew. What kind of man did such a thing? Certainly not the arrogant, detached figure she had believed him to be. Perhaps there was more to Knox Blackwood than met the eye. The thought unsettled her in ways she didn't entirely understand. Tabitha shook her head, as if to clear it of such distractions, and forced herself to focus on her patient notes. But even as she wrote, a part of her remained attuned to the storm outside, listening for any sign that might herald the return of the lone rider who had disappeared into the blizzard. Dawn brought no relief from the storm. If anything, it had intensified overnight. the wind driving the snow horizontally across the landscape. Knox stood in the doorway of the lined shack, assessing the conditions with a grim expression. Visibility was poor, maybe 20 feet at best, and the snow was already knee-deep in places. Midnight nickered softly from the lean-to, as if questioning the wisdom of continuing their journey. Knox shared the sentiment, but the image of Theodore Murray's infected arm and Tabitha's worried face spurred him on. "No help for it, boy," he said, returning to prepare Midnight for the day's ride. "We've got a job to do." Within half an hour, they were once again battling the elements, Knox leading Midnight through the deepest drifts, his own legs breaking trail where necessary. The going was agonizingly slow, each step requiring effort, each mile a victory against the relentless storm. By midday, they had reached Mason's Pass, the narrow trail that wound between two towering peaks. In good weather, it was a tricky but manageable route. In this blizzard, it was treacherous beyond measure. Knox dismounted, knowing that Midnight would need all his focus to navigate the slippery, snow-covered path. The wind howled through the pass like a banshee, finding every gap in Knox's clothing, every exposed inch of skin. His face burned with cold despite the scarf wrapped around the lower half, and his feet had long since gone numb. "Easy now," he murmured to Midnight as they began the ascent. "Nice and slow." The trail narrowed dangerously, a sheer drop on one side, a wall of rock on the other. Knox kept one hand on Midnight's bridle, the other braced against the rock face for balance. Every step was a calculated risk, every foot of progress a small miracle in the face of nature's fury. They were halfway through the pass when disaster struck. A gust of wind more powerful than any before it slammed into them, accompanied by a blinding curtain of snow. Midnight reared, startled, and Knox lost his footing on the icy trail. He fell hard, striking his head against the rock wall, and for a moment the world went dark. When consciousness returned, he was lying half buried in snow, blood trickling down the side of his face, and Midnight was gone. "Midnight," Knox called out, his voice immediately swallowed by the howling wind. He struggled to his feet, fighting off a wave of dizziness, and peered through the blinding snow for any sign of the horse. Nothing. Panic, an emotion Knox rarely allowed himself to feel, began to rise in his chest. Without Midnight, without the medicine in his saddlebags, Theodore Murray would likely die. And without shelter, Knox himself might not survive much longer. He forced himself to think clearly, to push aside the pain and fear. Midnight was a smart horse. He wouldn't have gone far in this storm. Most likely he had continued forward, seeking shelter or at least a place where the wind wasn't quite so brutal. Knox began to move, following the narrow trail, one hand against the rock wall for guidance. Each step was agony, his head throbbing, his body protesting the continued abuse. But he pushed on, driven by a determination that bordered on stubbornness. "Midnight," he called again, hoping against hope that the horse was within earshot. To his astonishment, a familiar whinny answered him, faint but unmistakable. Knox quickened his pace, following the sound, and soon spotted a dark shape against the white landscape ahead. Midnight stood in a small alcove where the rock wall curved inward, providing a modest shelter from the worst of the wind. The horse appeared unharmed, though clearly distressed, his eyes wide and nostrils flaring. "Good boy," Knox said, relief flooding through him as he reached the horse and checked him over. "Smart boy, finding shelter." He checked the saddlebags. The medicine was still secure. But the fall had taken its toll on Knox. His head wound, though not deep, continued to bleed, and the dizziness was getting worse, not better. He knew the signs of concussion well enough to recognize them. Still, there was no choice but to continue. They were closer to Silverton now than to Copper Creek, and Theodore Murray needed that medicine. Knox mounted Midnight with difficulty, his limbs stiff and uncooperative, and urged the horse forward once more. The remainder of the pass proved just as treacherous, but they navigated it without further incident. As they began the descent toward Silverton, the wind lessened slightly, though the snow continued to fall in thick, heavy flakes. It was late afternoon by the time the lights of Silverton appeared through the curtain of white small, flickering beacons of civilization in the wild expanse of the storm-tossed mountains. Knox felt a surge of triumph, quickly tempered by the knowledge that they had only completed half their journey. They still had to return to Copper Creek with the medicine, but first they needed to find Dr. Abernathy. Silverton was a larger town than Copper Creek, with several saloons, a hotel, and various businesses lining its main street. Knox guided Midnight toward the center of town, looking for any sign that might indicate the doctor's office. He spotted it finally, a modest building with a sign swinging in the wind. Dr. J. Abernathy, physician and surgeon. Knox dismounted, nearly collapsing as his feet hit the ground, and tied Midnight to the hitching post. The door opened before he could knock, revealing a portly, white-haired man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose. "Good heavens, man!" the doctor exclaimed, taking in Knox's snow-covered form and the blood frozen to the side of his face. "Get in here before you freeze to death." Knox stumbled into the warmth of the office, fumbling in his pocket for the note Tabitha had given him. "Medicine," he managed to say, his voice rough from hours of cold and disuse. "Need medicine for Copper Creek." Dr. Abernathy took the note, reading it quickly. "You rode from Copper Creek." "In this storm?" His voice was incredulous. "For medicine," Knox nodded, wincing at the pain the movement caused. "Man's dying. Infected wound. Dr. Winters sent me." "Tabitha Winters." Dr. Abernathy's eyebrows rose. "James Winters' daughter." "Yes," Knox confirmed, swaying slightly on his feet. "She needs quinine. Silver nitrate." Dr. Abernathy shook his head in amazement. "Sit down before you fall down, young man. Let me see to that head wound while I prepare what you need." Knox didn't argue, collapsing into a chair near the stove. The warmth was almost painful against his frozen skin, but he welcomed it nonetheless. Dr. Abernathy busied himself gathering bottles from a cabinet, then returned to examine Knox's injury. "You're lucky it's not worse," the doctor commented, cleaning the wound with antiseptic that stung fiercely. "But you've got a concussion, no doubt about it. You should rest here tonight." "Can't," Knox said firmly. "Need to get back. Murray doesn't have time." Dr. Abernathy frowned. "Young man, you won't be any help to anyone if you die in that pass. The storm, I made it here," Knox interrupted. "I can make it back." The doctor studied him for a long moment, then sighed in resignation. "You cowboys and your stubborn pride." He finished bandaging Knox's head, then handed him a small package. "Here's everything Tabitha asked for, plus some extra quinine and morphine. And this," he pressed a small bottle into Knox's hand, "is for you. Drink it now. It'll help with the pain and give you some energy for the return journey." Knox uncorked the bottle and downed the bitter liquid in one swallow. "Thank you, doctor." "Don't thank me," Dr. Abernathy grumbled. "I think you're a fool to attempt the return journey tonight, but I understand why you feel you must." He hesitated, then added, "Tell Tabitha that Joseph Abernathy sends his regards. Her father was a good friend of mine." Knox nodded, tucking the medicine securely into his coat. The tonic was already taking effect, dulling the pain in his head and bringing a renewed clarity to his thoughts. "I should go," he said, rising to his feet with more steadiness than before. "While there's still some daylight left." Dr. Abernathy shook his head but didn't try to stop him. God go with you, young man. You're going to need all the help you can get. Knox left the doctor's office, the package of life-saving medicine secure against his chest, and untied midnight from the hitching post. The horse looked at him with what Knox could have sworn was reproach. "I know, boy," he said, patting the animal's neck, "but we're not done yet." As they turned back toward the mountain pass, the snow continuing to fall around them, Knox couldn't help but wonder if Dr. Abernathy was right, if this return journey was indeed a fool's errand. But then he thought of Theodore Murray, fighting for his life, and of Tabitha Winters, waiting for the medicine that could save her patient. He urged Midnight forward, back into the teeth of the storm, determination overriding his exhaustion and pain. They had come this far. They would make it the rest of the way. The storm that had raged for a day and a night was finally beginning to abate. Tabitha stood at the window of her clinic, watching as the first pale light of dawn revealed a town transformed by snow. Drifts piled against buildings, burying fences and wagons, turning Copper Creek into an alien landscape of white. Behind her, Theodore Murray moaned softly in his sleep. His condition had worsened overnight, the infection spreading despite Tabitha's best efforts. His fever burned dangerously high, and she had been forced to wake Martha an hour earlier when he began to hallucinate, calling out for people who weren't there. "How much longer can he hold on?" Martha asked quietly, her voice rough from a night spent between tears and prayers. Tabitha turned from the window, her face composed despite the weight of responsibility she felt. "He's fighting hard, Mrs. Murray, and the storm is easing, if Mr. Blackwood made it to Silverton." She let the sentence hang, unwilling to offer false hope. If Knox had reached Silverton, if he had obtained the medicine, if he had started the return journey immediately, if he had survived the treacherous mountain pass a second time, so many ifs stood between Theodore Murray and his survival. "Would you like some coffee, doctor?" Martha offered, clearly needing something to occupy her hands and mind. "I could make a fresh pot." Tabitha smiled gratefully. "That would be wonderful, thank you." As Martha busied herself with the coffee pot on the small stove, Tabitha returned to Theodore's side. She checked his pulse, rapid and thready, and placed a fresh, cool cloth on his forehead. The angry red streaks had extended further up his arm overnight, a clear sign that the infection was advancing toward his heart. Without the quinine to fight the systemic infection and the silver nitrate to cauterize the wound itself, there was little more she could do. The thought filled her with a frustration so acute it bordered on anger. She had trained for years to save lives, had dedicated herself to the healing arts, yet here she was, helpless in the face of a simple infection because she lacked the proper tools. And somewhere out in that vast expanse of snow and mountains was a man who might be carrying those tools, a man who might be fighting for his own life even now. The image of Knox Blackwood, frozen and alone in the wilderness, sent an unexpected pang through her chest. Why should she care so much about the fate of a man she barely knew? A man who irritated her more often than not with his reserved manner and knowing looks, yet she did care. More than she was ready to admit, even to herself. A sound from outside drew her attention, the distant but unmistakable jingle of harness bells. Tabitha rushed to the window, her heart suddenly racing. "Someone's coming," she said, straining to see through the snowy haze. Martha joined her at the window, hope lighting her tired eyes. "Is it him? Is it Mr. Blackwood?" For a long moment, they could see nothing but swirling snow. Then, like a ghost materializing from the white void, a dark shape appeared at the end of the street, a horse and rider, moving slowly but steadily toward the clinic. "It's him," Tabitha breathed, hardly daring to believe it. "It's Mr. Blackwood." She grabbed her coat and rushed to the door, not bothering with a hat or gloves in her haste. Outside, the cold air bit at her exposed skin, but she barely noticed as she hurried down the steps and into the street. Knox was barely recognizable beneath layers of ice and snow. He sat slumped in the saddle, one hand clutching Midnight's mane, the other pressed protectively against his chest. As Tabitha approached, she could see that his face was pale beneath the reddened skin exposed to the elements, his eyes glazed with exhaustion. "Mr. Blackwood," she called, reaching for Midnight's bridle. "Knox." At the sound of his given name on her lips, Knox's eyes focused on her face. A ghost of a smile touched his cracked lips. "Doc," he managed, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Got your medicine." He fumbled at his coat, his movements clumsy with cold and fatigue, and produced a small package wrapped in oilskin. Tabitha took it with trembling hands, relief washing over her like a physical force. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Knox nodded once, then seemed to sway in the saddle. Tabitha realized with alarm that he was on the verge of collapse. "Come inside," she urged. "You need to get warm." But Knox shook his head. "Take care of Murray first, I'll see to Midnight." "Mr. Blackwood, you're in no condition." "Midnight first," Knox insisted, his voice strengthening slightly. "Then Murray, then me." Tabitha recognized the stubborn set of his jaw and knew arguing would be futile. "Fine, but be quick about it. You're showing signs of hypothermia." She hurried back to the clinic, the precious package clutched against her chest. Inside, Martha looked up with anxious eyes. "He made it," Tabitha announced, already unwrapping the package to reveal several bottles of medicine. "He brought everything we need." Martha burst into tears of relief, clutching her husband's limp hand. "Thank God, oh thank God." Tabitha worked quickly, preparing a solution of quinine and measuring out a dose with steady hands. She administered it to Theodore, then turned her attention to the wound itself, cleaning it thoroughly before applying the silver nitrate to cauterize the infected tissue. Theodore groaned in pain, his eyes fluttering open briefly before closing again. It was a good sign he was still responsive to pain, still fighting. "That should start to work quickly," Tabitha told Martha, her professional demeanor firmly in place despite the emotional turmoil of the past hours. "The quinine will fight the blood infection, and the silver nitrate will help kill the infection in the wound itself." Martha nodded, wiping away tears. "And Mr. Blackwood, is he all right?" Tabitha glanced toward the door, realizing that Knox had not yet come inside. "I need to check on him." "Will you stay with your husband?" "Of course," Martha replied. Tabitha grabbed her medical bag and hurried outside once more. She found Knox in the small stable behind the clinic, just finishing with Midnight. The horse had been unsaddled and rubbed down, and Knox was now spreading a blanket over his back. "Mr. Blackwood," Tabitha said sharply, taking in his unsteady movements and the alarming pallor of his skin. "You need medical attention immediately." Knox turned, and Tabitha gasped as she saw the blood-soaked bandage on the side of his head. "What happened?" "Little accident in the pass," Knox replied, his words slightly slurred. "Dr. Abernathy patched me up." "Clearly not well enough," Tabitha said, moving to his side and taking his arm. "Come inside now. That's an order." To her surprise, Knox didn't resist, allowing her to guide him from the stable and into the clinic. His compliance worried her more than his visible injuries. It suggested he was far more debilitated than he was letting on. Inside, she led him to a chair near the stove and helped him remove his frozen outer layers. His skin was cold to the touch, his fingers and ears showing early signs of frostbite. "How is Murray?" Knox asked as Tabitha began to examine his head wound. "The medicine arrived in time," she replied, carefully removing the soiled bandage. It's too early to say for certain, but I believe he'll recover. Knox nodded, wincing as her fingers probed the edges of the wound. Good, that's good. Tabitha worked in silence for a few minutes, cleaning the injury and applying a fresh bandage. The cut wasn't as bad as the amount of blood had suggested. Head wounds always bled profusely, but she was concerned about the concussion that had clearly accompanied it. "You should have stayed in Silverton," she said finally, unable to keep the accusation from her voice. Making the return journey with a head injury was reckless. Knox's blue eyes met hers, surprisingly clear despite his exhaustion. Murray needed the medicine. And what good would the medicine have done if you had died bringing it? Tabitha countered, echoing Dr. Abernathy's sentiment without realizing it. A faint smile touched Knox's lips. Abernathy said the same thing. "Because it's true," Tabitha said, softening her tone slightly. "Though I am grateful that you made it." She moved on to check his extremities for frostbite, her touch clinical but gentle as she examined his fingers and ears. The skin was red and swollen, but she detected no sign of the telltale blackening that indicated severe tissue damage. "You're lucky," she said, applying a soothing salve to the affected areas. "A few more hours in that cold and you might have lost fingers or ears." "Would have ruined my good looks," Knox commented dryly. Despite herself, Tabitha felt a smile tug at the corners of her mouth. "I see your brush with death hasn't affected your sense of humor. Takes more than a blizzard to do that, Doc." They fell silent again as Tabitha continued her examination, checking his vital signs and looking for any other injuries he might have sustained during his journey. His pulse was steady if a bit slow, and his breathing was regular. The main concerns were the concussion and the hypothermia. "You need rest," she said finally, straightening up. "And warmth. Lots of both." "I can make it back to my room at the boarding house," Knox said, making as if to stand. Tabitha placed a firm hand on his shoulder, keeping him seated. "You most certainly cannot. You have a concussion, Mr. Blackwood. You need to be monitored for at least the next 24 hours. Knox looked as though he might argue, but then seemed to think better of it. "Where then?" Tabitha hesitated, considering her options. The clinic had only 2 rooms suitable for patients: the main examination room where they currently were, and the small back room where Theodore and Martha were settled. The only other option was her own living quarters above the clinic. "You'll have to take my bed," she said decisively. "I can sleep in the chair down here to keep an eye on Mr. Murray." Knox's eyebrows rose slightly. "Your bed? That seems improper, Doc." Tabitha felt a flush rise to her cheeks, but she kept her expression stern. "This is a medical decision, Mr. Blackwood. Propriety has nothing to do with it." To her surprise, Knox chuckled, a low, warm sound that seemed at odds with his half-frozen state. "If you say so." With some difficulty, Tabitha helped him up the narrow stairs to her small apartment above the clinic. It was a modest space, a single room with a bed, a small table with 2 chairs, a dresser, and a wood stove that provided heat. A screen in one corner concealed a washstand and chamber pot. "It's not much," Tabitha said, suddenly self-conscious about the simplicity of her living quarters. "It's perfect," Knox replied, his gaze taking in the neat, feminine touches that made the space distinctly hers: the crocheted blanket at the foot of the bed, the small vase of dried wildflowers on the table, the row of books lined up on a shelf near the window. Tabitha busied herself with the wood stove, adding fuel to build up the heat in the room. "You should change out of those damp clothes," she said, not looking at him. "I'll find you something dry to wear." She rummaged in a trunk at the foot of the bed and produced a flannel nightshirt. "It was my father's," she explained, holding it out to him. "It should fit well enough." Knox took the garment with a nod of thanks. "I appreciate all this, Doc. "You saved a man's life today, Mr. Blackwood," Tabitha replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "It's the least I can do." She left him to change, returning downstairs to check on Theodore. To her relief, his fever seemed to have abated slightly, and the angry red streaks on his arm appeared less vivid. Martha had fallen asleep in the chair beside his bed, her hand still clasping her husband's. Tabitha adjusted Theodore's blankets and checked his pulse, satisfied with what she found. The medicine was working. With continued treatment and rest, he should make a full recovery. She prepared a tray with soup, bread, and tea, then returned upstairs to find Knox sitting on the edge of her bed, dressed in the borrowed nightshirt, his damp clothes hung over the back of a chair near the stove. "You should eat something," she said, setting the tray on the small table. "Then rest." Knox nodded, moving to the table with careful, measured movements that betrayed his lingering dizziness. He ate slowly, his exhaustion evident in every line of his body. Tabitha watched him, her professional assessment mixing with a more personal concern that she wasn't quite ready to acknowledge. "Dr. Abernathy did a good job with that head wound," she commented, "though you shouldn't have continued traveling immediately after sustaining it." Knox paused, his spoon halfway to his mouth. "Didn't have much choice. Murray needed the medicine." "Yes, you've mentioned that," Tabitha said dryly. "What I don't understand is why you volunteered in the first place." Knox was silent for a long moment, his blue eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. But she held his gaze, waiting for his answer. "Someone needed help," he said finally, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "I was in a position to provide it." "But at such risk to yourself," Tabitha pressed. "You didn't even know Theodore Murray." "Didn't need to know him," Knox replied, returning his attention to his soup. "Just needed to know he was in trouble." Tabitha shook her head, both exasperated and impressed by his simple logic. "Most men wouldn't see it that way." A ghost of a smile touched Knox's lips. "Maybe I'm not most men, Doc." "No," Tabitha thought, "you certainly are not," but she kept the observation to herself, instead rising to collect his empty bowl. "You should sleep now," she said. "I'll check on you every few hours because of the concussion." Knox nodded, already moving toward the bed, his movements growing more sluggish as the last of his reserves began to fade. "Thank you, Tabitha," he said quietly, using her given name for the first time. The simple intimacy of it caught her off guard, sending a warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire in the stove. "You're welcome, Knox," she replied, equally soft. She turned down the lamp and left him to his rest, closing the door quietly behind her. As she descended the stairs to check on Theodore once more, Tabitha found herself pondering the enigma that was Knox Blackwood, a man who would risk his life for a stranger, who seemed both entirely self-sufficient and somehow lonely, whose rare smile could light something unexpected within her. Perhaps, she thought, there was more to the quiet cowboy than she had initially believed, and perhaps that was a discovery worth pursuing. Knox drifted in and out of consciousness, his dreams a confused jumble of swirling snow, treacherous mountain passes, and green eyes filled with concern. He was vaguely aware of Tabitha coming to check on him periodically, her cool hand against his forehead, her voice soft as she asked him questions to assess his mental state. "What's your full name?" she would ask. "Knox Jameson Blackwood," he would reply, the words automatic. "Do you know where you are?" "Your bed, Doc," he once answered with a hint of his usual dryness, and was rewarded with a smile that seemed to brighten the dim room. When he finally woke fully, sunlight was streaming through the small window, suggesting it was well into the following day. Knox sat up cautiously, relieved to find that the dizziness had subsided and the throbbing in his head had reduced to a dull ache. He took a moment to look around Tabitha's room in the clear light of day. It was as neat and practical as the woman herself, yet there were touches of warmth and personality throughout a patchwork quilt folded at the foot of the bed. A small framed drawing of what appeared to be a family, her family, he presumed. A shelf of well-worn books that ranged from medical texts to volumes of poetry. Knox was examining the titles when the door opened, and Tabitha entered with a tray of food. She paused, seeing him up and about, and a smile of relief crossed her face. "You're looking much better," she observed, setting the tray on the table. "How do you feel?" "Like I rode through a blizzard, fell off my horse, and hit my head on a rock," Knox replied with a wry smile. "But otherwise not bad." Tabitha's laugh was unexpected and delightful, a clear, bright sound that Knox immediately decided he wanted to hear more often. "Well, at least your memory is intact," she said, gesturing to the tray. "I brought breakfast. You must be hungry." Knox realized he was, in fact, ravenously hungry. He moved to the table and sat down, appreciating the simple but hearty meal of eggs, bacon, and biscuits. "How is Murray?" he asked between bites. "Much improved," Tabitha replied, her face brightening with professional satisfaction. "The fever broke early this morning and the infection is receding. He'll need rest and continued treatment, but I believe he's out of danger." "Good," Knox said simply. "That's good." Tabitha studied him for a moment, her head tilted slightly to one side. "You know, most men would be boasting about their heroic journey through the blizzard, expecting gratitude, recognition." Knox shrugged, uncomfortable with the implied praise. "Nothing heroic about it. Just did what needed doing." "And nearly died in the process," Tabitha pointed out. "But didn't," Knox countered, "so no harm done." Tabitha shook her head, a mixture of exasperation and something warmer in her expression. "You're a puzzling man, Knox Blackwood." Knox raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "You present yourself as this solitary, detached figure, the mysterious cowboy who keeps to himself. Yet when someone needs help, you're the first to offer it, regardless of the risk to yourself." She paused, her green eyes searching his face. "It doesn't quite add up." Knox was silent for a moment, considering his response. Tabitha Winters was perhaps the first person in Copper Creek who had tried to see beyond the surface he presented to the world. It was both unsettling and oddly gratifying. "Maybe there's not much to add up," he said finally. "I believe in helping those who need it when I can. Doesn't make me special." "I disagree," Tabitha said quietly. "I think it makes you quite special indeed." There was a warmth in her voice that caught Knox off guard, sending a flutter of something unfamiliar through his chest. He looked up to find her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. The moment stretched between them, charged with an unexpected tension. Then Tabitha cleared her throat and took a step back, her professional demeanor sliding back into place. "Your clothes should be dry," she said, gesturing to where his things hung near the stove. "Once you're dressed, I should check that head wound again." Knox nodded, grateful for the return to practical matters. "Thank you for the breakfast, Doc, and for letting me use your bed." "You're welcome," Tabitha replied, moving toward the door. "Though I expect you'll be eager to return to your own lodgings." It was a statement, not a question, but Knox found himself hesitating before answering. "I suppose I should once you've given me the all-clear." Tabitha nodded, her hand on the doorknob. "I'll be downstairs when you're ready." After she left, Knox dressed slowly, his body still stiff and sore from the ordeal of the past 2 days. His thoughts, however, were not on his physical discomfort, but on the woman who had just left the room, a woman who, until yesterday, he had viewed primarily as an intriguing irritant. Now, he found himself seeing her through new eyes. Tabitha Winters was not just competent and intelligent, though she was certainly both. She was also compassionate, dedicated, and possessed of a dry wit that matched his own. And when she smiled, really smiled, not the polite expression she wore for her patients, it transformed her face in a way that made something tighten in Knox's chest. It was a dangerous line of thinking. Knox had spent years keeping people at a distance, avoiding entanglements that could only lead to complication and, eventually, pain. He had learned that lesson the hard way, and he wasn't eager to repeat the experience. And yet, as he made his way downstairs to have his wound examined, Knox couldn't quite shake the feeling that something had shifted between them during his journey through the blizzard, something that might not be so easily dismissed. Theodore Murray was sitting up in bed when Tabitha entered the back room of the clinic, his color markedly improved from the day before. Martha sat beside him, her face reflecting the relief and gratitude that comes after a brush with tragedy. "Good morning, Mr. Murray," Tabitha said, pleased to see the visible improvement in her patient. "You're looking much better today." "Feeling better too, Doc," Theodore replied, his voice still weak but clearer than it had been. "Martha tells me I have Mr. Blackwood to thank for that." Tabitha nodded, checking his pulse and examining the wound, which was now showing clear signs of healing. "Mr. Blackwood rode through the blizzard to Silverton and back to fetch the medicine you needed. It was quite extraordinary." "How is he?" Martha asked. "We were so worried when we learned he'd been injured." "He's recovering well," Tabitha assured them. "The concussion was mild and he suffered no serious frostbite. With rest, he should be fine." "We owe him our lives," Theodore said solemnly. "Both of us. If not for him, I wouldn't be here now." Tabitha couldn't disagree. Without the medicine Knox had brought, Theodore would almost certainly have succumbed to the infection. "He's a remarkable man," she said softly, more to herself than to the Murrays. Martha gave her a knowing look that Tabitha pretended not to notice. "I'll change your bandage now, Mr. Murray," she said, turning her attention firmly back to her patient. "Then you should rest some more. Your body needs time to heal." As she worked, Tabitha heard footsteps on the stairs and knew that Knox had come down. She finished with Theodore, gave Martha instructions for his care, and then returned to the main room of the clinic. Knox stood near the window, looking out at the snow-covered town. He had dressed in his own clothes, which appeared mostly dry, though his coat still hung near the stove upstairs. He turned as she entered, and Tabitha was struck again by the quiet strength in his lean frame, the intelligence in his blue eyes. "Your patient seems to be doing well," Knox observed. "Yes, he is," Tabitha replied, gesturing for him to take a seat so she could examine his head wound. "Thanks to you." Knox sat in the chair she indicated, submitting to her examination without protest. Tabitha worked carefully, removing the bandage and checking the wound for any signs of infection. "It's healing nicely," she reported. "The swelling has gone down considerably." "So I'm fit to leave?" Knox asked, his tone neutral. Tabitha hesitated. Medically speaking, there was no reason to keep him under observation any longer. The concussion symptoms had abated and the wound was clean and healing well, but she found herself reluctant to discharge him so quickly. "I would prefer if you remained nearby for another day," she said finally. "Concussions can be unpredictable and symptoms sometimes return after apparent improvement." It was a slight exaggeration of the risk, and from the look Knox gave her, she suspected he knew it, but he didn't call her on it. "If you think it's necessary, Doc," he said mildly, "I can return to the boarding house. It's not far." "That would be acceptable," Tabitha agreed, finishing with the fresh bandage. "But I want you to check in with me this evening and again tomorrow morning." "Yes, madam," Knox replied, the faintest hint of amusement in his voice. Tabitha stepped back, suddenly aware of how close they had been standing. "I'll get your coat," she said, turning toward the stairs. "No need," Knox said, rising from the chair. "I can get it myself." "You have patients to attend to." "Just Mr. Murray at the moment," Tabitha replied, "and he's stable." An awkward silence fell between them, neither quite sure how to proceed. It was Knox who finally broke it. "I wanted to thank you," he said, his voice low and sincere, "for taking care of me." "It was the least I could do," Tabitha replied, echoing her words from the night before. "After what you did for Theodore." Knox nodded, his eyes holding hers for a long moment. Then he moved toward the stairs, ascending them with careful steps that betrayed his lingering weakness. Tabitha watched him go, a strange mixture of emotions swirling within her. Relief that he was recovering well, admiration for his selfless courage, and something else, something warmer and more personal that she wasn't quite ready to name. Knox returned a few minutes later, his coat draped over his arm. "I'll be going then," he said, moving toward the door. "I'll stop by this evening as ordered, Doc." Tabitha smiled despite herself. "See that you do, Mr. Blackwood. Doctor's orders are not to be taken lightly." Knox paused with his hand on the doorknob, turning back to look at her with an expression that made her breath catch. "I wouldn't dream of it," he said softly. And then he was gone, the door closing quietly behind him, leaving Tabitha standing in the middle of her clinic with the distinct feeling that something important had just begun. The next few days passed in a blur of activity for Tabitha. Theodore Murray continued to improve, and by the third day after Knox's return, he was well enough to be moved home. The weather had cleared, the roads were gradually being cleared of snow, and life in Copper Creek was returning to its normal rhythm. Knox, true to his word, had checked in with her each evening and morning for the first 2 days after leaving her clinic. His head wound was healing well, and the concussion symptoms had fully resolved. On his second evening visit, they had shared a cup of coffee at her small table upstairs, talking easily about the town, the weather, and Knox's work at the Peterson Ranch. It was during that conversation that Tabitha learned more about the man behind the reserved exterior. Knox had been a cavalry scout during the war, had worked as a ranch hand across several states since, and had come to Colorado looking for a fresh start after some trouble in Wyoming that he didn't elaborate on. "And what brought you to Copper Creek specifically?" Tabitha had asked, curious about what had drawn him to their small mountain town. Knox had shrugged, his expression thoughtful. "Heard they needed experienced hands at the Peterson place. Seemed as good a reason as any." "And will you stay?" The question had slipped out before Tabitha could consider its implications. Knox had looked at her then, his blue eyes searching hers. "I hadn't planned to," he'd admitted, "but plans can change." There had been something in his tone, in the way he'd held her gaze, that had sent a warmth spreading through Tabitha that had nothing to do with the coffee she was drinking. Now, a week after the blizzard, Tabitha found herself thinking about that conversation as she prepared the clinic for the day. Knox hadn't visited since that evening, though she had caught glimpses of him in town buying supplies at the general store, having a drink at the saloon with some of the other ranch hands. She told herself it was natural that their interactions would decrease as he recovered. There was no medical reason for him to continue checking in with her. And yet, she found herself missing his dry humor, his quiet observations, the way his rare smile seemed to transform his entire face. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Tabitha smoothed down her skirt and moved to answer it, expecting Mrs. Jenkins, who had scheduled an appointment for her arthritis. Instead, she found Knox standing on her porch, hat in hand, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "Is everything all right?" "Your head—" "My head's fine, Doc," Knox assured her quickly. "I didn't come for medical reasons." "Oh." Tabitha wasn't sure what to say next. "Would you like to come in?" Knox nodded, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. He seemed different, somehow less the self-assured cowboy and more nervous. "I was wondering," he began, turning his hat in his hands, "if you might consider having dinner with me this evening, at the hotel restaurant." Tabitha stared at him, momentarily speechless. Of all the reasons she had imagined for his visit, this had not been among them. "Dinner," she repeated, as if to be sure she had heard correctly. "Yes." Knox met her gaze directly now, a hint of his usual confidence returning. "I believe it's customary when a man wishes to spend time with a woman he admires." Admires. The word sent a flutter through Tabitha's stomach. I'm not sure what to say." "Yes would be the preferred answer," Knox said, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "But I'll understand if you'd rather not." Tabitha considered the proposition. Dinner with Knox Blackwood. In public, where everyone in town would see them together and draw their own conclusions. It was a significant step, one that would undoubtedly set tongues wagging in Copper Creek. But as she looked at him standing there, his blue eyes watching her with a mixture of hope and resignation, Tabitha found she didn't care what people might say. "Yes," she said finally, a smile spreading across her face. "I would like that very much." The relief and pleasure that transformed Knox's features was worth any gossip their dinner might generate. 7 o'clock, he suggested. "I'll come by to escort you." 7 would be perfect, Tabitha agreed. Knox nodded, settling his hat back on his head. "Until this evening, then, Doc." "Until this evening," Tabitha echoed, watching as he turned to leave. At the door, he paused and looked back at her, a warmth in his eyes that sent another flutter through her chest. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I never expected to find anything like this in Copper Creek." "Like what?" Tabitha asked, her voice softer than she intended. Knox's smile deepened, reaching his eyes. "Something worth staying for." And with that, he was gone, leaving Tabitha standing in her clinic with a racing heart and the distinct feeling that her life was about to change in ways she had never anticipated. The hotel restaurant was the most elegant establishment in Copper Creek, which wasn't saying much by the standards of larger cities. But with its white tablecloths, polished silverware, and actual printed menus, it was considered quite sophisticated by local standards. Tabitha had spent an embarrassing amount of time choosing her attire for the evening, finally settling on a deep green dress that she rarely had occasion to wear. She had twisted her chestnut hair into a more elaborate style than her usual practical bun, and had even added a touch of her mother's old perfume. Now, seated across from Knox at a corner table, she found herself unreasonably nervous. Knox, for his part, looked more at ease than she had ever seen him. He had traded his usual work clothes for a clean black suit that fit his lean frame surprisingly well, and his dark hair was neatly combed. "You look beautiful," he said simply as they settled at the table, his direct gaze making her cheeks warm. "Thank you," Tabitha replied, smoothing her napkin across her lap. "You clean up rather well yourself, Mr. Blackwood." A smile touched his lips. "I think, given the circumstances, you might call me Knox." "Knox," Tabitha agreed, returning his smile. "And you should call me Tabitha." They ordered their meals: roast beef for Knox, chicken for Tabitha, and fell into surprisingly easy conversation. Knox asked about her training as a doctor, listening with genuine interest as she described the years spent learning from her father. "It couldn't have been easy," he observed. "Being a woman in medicine." Tabitha sighed. "It wasn't, still isn't sometimes. There are people in town who refuse to see me, who insist on traveling to Silverton to consult with Dr. Abernathy instead." "Their loss," Knox said with a shrug. "You're a fine doctor." The simple, matter-of-fact way he said it warmed Tabitha more than any flowery compliment could have. "Thank you. That means a great deal, coming from someone who's experienced my care firsthand." Knox's smile turned wry. "Even if I was an unwilling patient at times, especially then," Tabitha laughed. "The difficult ones are always the most satisfying to help." As they ate, Tabitha found herself growing more comfortable, the initial nervousness fading as they talked about everything from books. Knox, it turned out, was surprisingly well-read for a cowboy. To their respective childhoods, his in Texas, hers in Pennsylvania before her family moved west. It was only when their plates had been cleared and coffee served that Knox turned the conversation to more personal matters. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened during the blizzard," he said, his expression thoughtful as he gazed at her over the rim of his coffee cup. "I imagine it's not something one forgets easily," Tabitha replied. "It's not that." Knox set down his cup, his blue eyes serious. "It's more what it made me realize." Tabitha's heart quickened. "And what was that?" Knox was silent for a moment, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I've spent most of my adult life avoiding attachments, moving from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots." He paused, and Tabitha waited, sensing there was more he needed to say. "After the war, I didn't see much point in building connections that would only be broken when I inevitably moved on," Knox continued. "It was easier, safer to keep to myself." "What changed?" Tabitha asked softly. Knox met her gaze directly. "You did." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, profound in its honesty. "Me." Tabitha's voice was barely above a whisper. "You," Knox confirmed. "Or more accurately, what I felt when I thought I might not make it back from Silverton. It wasn't my life flashing before my eyes like they say happens. It was regret for the life I hadn't allowed myself to live, the connections I hadn't allowed myself to make." He paused. "Particularly with you." Tabitha felt as though the air had been drawn from her lungs. "We barely knew each other before the blizzard." "I knew enough," Knox said simply. "I knew you were intelligent, dedicated, compassionate. I knew you didn't suffer fools gladly. I knew your smile could light up a room." A hint of his own smile touched his lips. "I also knew you found me irritating." Tabitha couldn't help but laugh at that. Not irritating exactly, enigmatic perhaps, deliberately mysterious. "Fair enough," Knox conceded. "But the point is, I realized during that ride that I had been closing myself off from possibilities, from people, from you." His expression grew serious again. "And I decided that if I made it back, I would stop doing that." "Hence dinner," Tabitha said, understanding dawning. "Hence dinner," Knox agreed. "And hopefully, if you're amenable, more dinners to follow." Tabitha studied him, this man who had ridden through a blizzard to save a stranger's life, who had nearly died in the process, and who was now opening himself up to her with a vulnerability that touched her deeply. "I would like that," she said finally, her voice soft but clear. "Very much." The smile that spread across Knox's face was like the sun breaking through clouds, radiant and transformative. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "I'm glad to hear it, Tabitha," he said, her name sounding like music on his lips. "Very glad indeed." As they left the restaurant a short while later, stepping out into the clear, cold night, Knox offered Tabitha his arm. She took it without hesitation, feeling a sense of rightness in the simple gesture. They walked slowly back toward her clinic, neither in a hurry to end the evening. The streets of Copper Creek were quiet, most of its residents already tucked away in their homes. Above them, the stars glittered in the black velvet of the sky, and their breath formed small clouds in the frosty air. "It's beautiful tonight," Tabitha observed, tipping her head back to look at the stars. Hard to believe that just a week ago we could barely see 3 feet in front of us because of the blizzard. Nature's like that, Knox replied, his voice thoughtful. Violent one day, peaceful the next. Always changing. Unlike people, Tabitha mused. We tend to resist change, don't we? Knox glanced down at her, his expression contemplative. Some changes are worth embracing. The words hung between them, laden with meaning. They had reached the clinic now, stopping at the bottom of the steps that led to the front door. "Thank you for dinner," Tabitha said, turning to face him. "I enjoyed it very much." "As did I," Knox replied, his eyes never leaving hers. There was a moment of suspended anticipation, a breath where the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them standing there beneath the stars. Then, with deliberate slowness, Knox leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, almost tentative at first, as if he was giving her the opportunity to pull away. But Tabitha had no desire to do so. Instead, she found herself responding, her hand coming up to rest against his chest as the kiss deepened. When they finally parted, Tabitha felt slightly dazed, her heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with the cold night air. "Good night, Tabitha," Knox said softly, his voice lower than usual. "Good night, Knox," she replied, her own voice not entirely steady. He waited until she was safely inside before turning to leave, and Tabitha watched through the window as he walked away, his tall figure eventually disappearing into the darkness. Closing the door, she leaned back against it, her fingers touching her lips where his had been moments before. Something had changed tonight, something profound and irrevocable. And despite her earlier observation about human resistance to change, Tabitha found herself embracing this particular transformation with a joy that filled her completely. Spring came early to Copper Creek that year, the heavy snows of winter giving way to rushing streams and fields dotted with wildflowers. With the change in seasons came a change in the town itself, new buildings under construction, more settlers arriving weekly, and a general sense of growth and prosperity. For Tabitha, the past 3 months had been a time of personal transformation as well. Her relationship with Knox had blossomed from those tentative beginnings into something deep and meaningful. They had fallen into a comfortable routine of dinners together several times a week, long walks on her rare days off, and quiet evenings spent reading or talking in her apartment above the clinic. Knox had proven himself to be not just brave and principled, but thoughtful, intelligent, and possessed of a dry wit that never failed to make her laugh. He had shared more of his past with her, the pain of losing his parents at a young age, the horrors he had witnessed during the war, the restlessness that had driven him from place to place in the years since. And Tabitha had opened up to him as well, telling him of her struggles to be taken seriously as a female doctor, her grief over her father's death, her determination to provide the best possible care for the people of Copper Creek, despite limited resources. They had grown together, learning each other's strengths and weaknesses, joys and sorrows. And somewhere along the way, without either of them quite realizing when it happened, they had fallen deeply in love. On a particularly fine April afternoon, Tabitha closed the clinic early, having seen her last patient of the day, ironically, Theodore Murray, coming in for a final check of his arm, which had healed completely. "Good as new, Doc," Theodore had declared, flexing his arm to demonstrate. "Don't even get twinges when the weather changes, like I feared I might." "I'm glad to hear it," Tabitha had replied, genuinely pleased with his recovery. "Just remember to clean any injuries properly in the future, no matter how minor they seem." "Oh, believe me, I learned my lesson," Theodore had assured her. "Martha won't let me forget it either. Still talks about how Mr. Blackwood saved my life." He had given Tabitha a knowing look. Speaking of Mr. Blackwood, I hear congratulations might be in order soon." Tabitha had felt her cheeks warm. "I'm not sure what you mean, Mr. Murray," Theodore had merely chuckled. "Small town, Doc. People notice things. And the way that man looks at you. Well, let's just say some things are clear as day to anyone with eyes." Now, as Tabitha tidied the clinic, she found herself thinking about Theodore's words. Was it really so obvious to everyone? And was there truly something to congratulate them for? She and Knox hadn't discussed the future in specific terms. He seemed content with their current arrangement, and Tabitha had been careful not to press, knowing his history of avoiding permanent attachments. But lately, she had begun to wonder if there might be more, if the life they were building together might one day include marriage, a home of their own, perhaps even children. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. Thrilled, because she had never felt for anyone what she felt for Knox Blackwood. Terrified, because wanting something so much gave it the power to hurt you deeply if it was denied. A knock at the door interrupted her musings. Tabitha glanced at the clock. It was too early for Knox, who had said he would come by after finishing his work at the ranch. She opened the door to find Martha Murray standing on the porch, a covered basket in her hands. "Mrs. Murray," Tabitha greeted her with surprise. "Is everything all right?" "I just saw your husband an hour ago." "Everything's fine, Doctor," Martha assured her with a warm smile. "I just wanted to bring you these." She held out the basket. "Fresh baked bread and preserves, a small token of our continued gratitude." "That's very kind but not necessary," Tabitha protested, even as she accepted the basket. "I was just doing my job. And we're just baking bread," Martha countered with a twinkle in her eye. "Please accept it. It would mean a great deal to us." "Then thank you," Tabitha said sincerely. "Would you like to come in for tea?" Martha shook her head. "Not today, thank you. Theodore's waiting with the wagon, but there is one more thing." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "Mr. Blackwood asked me to give you this when I saw you." Tabitha took the envelope with a questioning look. "Knox gave this to you. Ran into him at the general store," Martha explained. "Said he wanted to make sure you got it today." Curious now, Tabitha turned the envelope over in her hands. It was plain, with only her name written on the front in Knox's bold handwriting. "Well, I'd best be going," Martha said, a knowing smile playing around her lips. "Enjoy the bread, Doctor." After Martha left, Tabitha closed the door and opened the envelope with careful fingers. Inside was a simple note. "Meet me at Mason's Creek at sunset. Bring a shawl, the evenings are still cool. K." Tabitha read the note twice, her curiosity deepening. Mason's Creek was a beautiful spot about a mile outside of town, where a clear stream tumbled over rocks beneath a stand of cottonwood trees. She and Knox had walked there several times in recent weeks, admiring the wildflowers that carpeted the meadow surrounding it. But why this formal invitation, delivered through Martha Murray of all people? Knox usually simply told her his plans when they saw each other. Tabitha glanced at the clock again. Sunset was in about 2 hours, just enough time to finish her work, change her clothes, and make the walk to Mason's Creek. As she moved through her afternoon tasks, Tabitha found herself increasingly distracted by thoughts of what Knox might have planned. It wasn't like him to be mysterious. He was generally straightforward to the point of bluntness. Whatever this was, it was clearly out of the ordinary. By the time she changed into a fresh dress, a pale blue one that Knox had once said matched the sky on a clear day, and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, Tabitha's curiosity had given way to a nervous anticipation that made her hands tremble slightly as she pinned her hat in place. The walk to Mason's Creek was pleasant, the evening air fragrant with the scent of new growth and wildflowers. As Tabitha approached the spot, She saw Knox's horse, Midnight, tethered to a tree at the edge of the small meadow. And there, standing by the creek, was Knox himself, his tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun. He turned at the sound of her approach, and the smile that spread across his face sent a warmth through Tabitha that had nothing to do with the mild spring evening. "You came," he said, stepping forward to meet her. "Of course I came," Tabitha replied, returning his smile. "Though I must admit, your note had me curious." Knox took her hand, leading her toward the creek, where Tabitha now noticed a blanket spread on the ground, a small basket beside it. "I thought we might enjoy the sunset," he said, his voice casual but with an undercurrent of something Tabitha couldn't quite identify. "It's lovely," she agreed, allowing him to help her sit on the blanket. "But why the mystery? And why enlist Martha Murray as your messenger?" Knox settled beside her, his expression suddenly uncertain. "I wanted this to be special, and I ran into Martha at the store when I realized I wouldn't have time to tell you in person before now." There was a nervousness about him that Tabitha had never seen before, a tension in his shoulders, a hesitancy in his usually confident demeanor. It made her own nerves heighten in response. "Knox," she said gently, "what's going on?" He took a deep breath, then reached for her hand, his larger one enveloping hers. "Tabitha, I've been doing a lot of thinking lately, about the future, about us." Tabitha's heart began to race, but she remained silent, giving him space to continue. "Before I came to Copper Creek, I never stayed anywhere for long," Knox went on, his blue eyes serious as they held hers. "Never wanted to. There was always another horizon, another town, another job waiting. I told myself I preferred it that way, no attachments, no responsibilities beyond the immediate task at hand." He paused, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand. "Then I met you, and everything changed. Not all at once, I'm too stubborn for that." A small smile touched his lips. "But gradually, inevitably, like a river changing course." Knox shifted, turning to face her more directly. "The night of the blizzard, when I wasn't sure I'd make it back, I realized what I'd been missing all those years of wandering, what I'd been afraid to let myself have." "And what was that?" Tabitha asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "A home," Knox said simply. "Not just a place to sleep, but a true home, with someone to come back to, someone who makes every day better just by being in it." His eyes never left hers. "Someone like you, Tabitha." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box, and Tabitha's breath caught in her throat. "I love you," Knox said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "I love your intelligence, your compassion, your stubbornness, your smile. I love the way you care for your patients, the way you stand up for what's right, the way you've somehow made room in your life for a wanderer like me." He opened the box, revealing a simple but elegant ring with a small diamond that caught the last rays of the setting sun. "Tabitha Winters, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tabitha stared at the ring, then at Knox's face, a flood of emotions rendering her momentarily speechless. Joy, surprise, love, they all swirled together, bringing tears to her eyes. "Yes," she finally managed, her voice breaking on the single syllable. "Yes, Knox, I will marry you." The tension in Knox's face gave way to a smile of such pure happiness that it took Tabitha's breath away. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then cupped her face in his hands and kissed her with a tenderness that spoke volumes about his feelings. When they finally parted, Tabitha couldn't help but laugh, a sound of pure joy. "I can't believe this is happening," she admitted. "Part of me feared you might never want to settle down permanently." Knox smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I feared the same thing once, but that was before you. Before I understood that settling down with the right person isn't a constraint, it's freedom." The freedom to build something lasting, something meaningful. He gestured to the basket beside them. I brought champagne, seemed appropriate for the occasion. As Knox poured the champagne into two simple glasses he produced from the basket, Tabitha gazed at the ring on her finger, still hardly able to believe it was real. "When did you decide?" she asked. "To propose, I mean." Knox handed her a glass, considering the question. "I've been thinking about it for weeks," he admitted. "But I made the final decision 3 days ago when I was helping deliver a foal at the ranch." Tabitha raised an eyebrow. "A foal?" Knox laughed. "I know it doesn't sound romantic. But there was something about it, about seeing new life come into the world, about being part of creating something instead of just passing through. It made me realize that's what I want with you, to create a life together, to build something that lasts beyond us." He raised his glass. "To new beginnings." "To new beginnings," Tabitha echoed, touching her glass to his. As they sat together, watching the sun sink below the horizon and the first stars appear in the deepening blue of the sky, Tabitha felt a sense of profound contentment. 6 months ago, she could never have imagined herself here, engaged to the mysterious cowboy who had ridden through a blizzard and into her heart. Life, she reflected, often took the most unexpected turns. And sometimes, those turns led exactly where you were meant to be all along. The wedding took place in late June, when the mountains were lush with greenery and the meadows ablaze with wildflowers. It was a small ceremony, held in the town's modest church, with most of Copper Creek in attendance. Tabitha wore a dress of ivory silk, ordered specially from Denver, with a crown of white roses in her chestnut hair. Knox, looking both uncomfortable and handsome in a new black suit, waited for her at the altar, his expression transforming to one of awe as she walked down the aisle toward him. "You are so beautiful," he whispered as she reached his side, his voice rough with emotion. Tabitha smiled up at him, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "And you are the most handsome man I've ever seen," she whispered back, delighting in the flush that rose to his cheeks. The ceremony was simple but deeply meaningful. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, promises to support each other, to face life's challenges together, to build a home filled with love and respect. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Knox kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to Tabitha's eyes and cheers from the assembled guests. The celebration afterward was held in the town square, with tables laden with food prepared by nearly every woman in Copper Creek. There was music from a local fiddle player, dancing, and more laughter than Tabitha could remember hearing in one place. Theodore and Martha Murray were among the first to offer their congratulations, Theodore clasping Knox's hand firmly and declaring, "I always said you were a good man, Blackwood. Now you've gone and proved it by marrying our doctor." "Smartest thing I ever did," Knox replied with a smile, his arm around Tabitha's waist. As the celebration continued into the evening, Knox led Tabitha away from the crowd, to a quiet spot beneath an old oak tree at the edge of the square. "Happy?" he asked, his blue eyes studying her face in the soft light of the lantern strung throughout the square. "Incredibly," Tabitha replied, leaning into his embrace. "Though I still can't quite believe it's real, that we're married." "Believe it," Knox said, his arms tightening around her. "I'm not going anywhere, Mrs. Blackwood." The name sent a thrill through her. Tabitha Blackwood. It would take some getting used to, but she liked the sound of it. "I have something for you," Knox said, reaching into his pocket. "A wedding gift." He produced a small velvet pouch and placed it in her hand. Tabitha opened it curiously, tipping the contents into her palm. It was a key, old and ornate, clearly not new. "A key?" she questioned, looking up at him with confusion. Knox smiled, a hint of nervousness in his expression. "To our home." If you approve, that is. Our home, Tabitha repeated, her confusion deepening. But we haven't. I bought the old Sawyer place, Knox interrupted. Just outside of town. The house needs work, but the land is good, and it's only a 10-minute ride to your clinic, I thought. He hesitated. I thought we could make it ours. Build the life we want there. Tabitha stared at him, astonished. The Sawyer place was a beautiful property that had been sitting empty since old Mr. Sawyer passed away the previous year. It had a sturdy, if somewhat neglected, 2-story house, a barn, and several acres of good land with a stream running through it. When did you do this? She asked, still stunned by the revelation. Finalized it last week, Knox admitted. I wanted it to be a surprise. But if you don't like it, we can look for something else. I just thought. Tabitha silenced him with a kiss, pouring all her love and gratitude into it. When they finally parted, both breathless, she said, It's perfect, Knox. Absolutely perfect. Relief and happiness spread across his features. Really? You haven't even seen it yet? Not properly. I don't need to, Tabitha assured him. The fact that you did this, that you chose a place for us to build our life together, that's what matters to me. Knox cupped her face in his hands, his expression serious. I want to give you everything, Tabitha. A home, a family, a life worth living. I may not always know how, but I promise I'll never stop trying. We'll figure it out together, Tabitha said softly. That's what marriage is, isn't it? Learning as we go, supporting each other through the good and the bad. Knox smiled, the love in his eyes so clear it made her heart ache with happiness. Together, he agreed. I like the sound of that. As they rejoined the celebration, accepting congratulations and well wishes from the townspeople who had become their friends, Tabitha found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. It had begun with a blizzard and a desperate ride through the mountains, a selfless act by a man she had barely known. And it had led here, to this perfect day, to a future full of promise and possibility. Sometimes, Tabitha thought as she looked up at her husband, the most beautiful stories began in the most unexpected ways. And this was only the beginning of theirs. 5 years later, the early morning sun streamed through the curtains of the bedroom, casting a golden glow over the sleeping forms of Knox and Tabitha Blackwood. It was Knox who stirred first, his eyes opening to the familiar and beloved sight of his wife curled against him. Her chestnut hair spread across the pillow. 5 years of marriage had only deepened his love for her. Every day, he found new reasons to be grateful for the twist of fate that had brought them together, the blizzard that had nearly claimed his life, but had given him something far more precious in return. He watched her sleep for a few moments, admiring the peaceful expression on her face, the gentle rise and fall of her chest. Then, knowing she would need to rise soon to prepare for her day at the clinic, he leaned over and pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. Morning, he murmured as her eyes fluttered open. Tabitha smiled, that same smile that had captivated him from the beginning. Good morning, she replied, her voice still husky with sleep. What time is it? Early yet, Knox assured her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. But I thought you might want to check on Lily before you head to town. At the mention of their daughter, Tabitha's smile widened. I always want to check on Lily, she said, sitting up and reaching for her robe. Is she awake? Not when I looked in on her a few minutes ago, Knox replied. But you know our girl, she could wake up ready to conquer the world at any moment. Tabitha laughed, the sound as musical to Knox's ears as it had been the first time he heard it. She does have her father's energy. And her mother's determination, Knox added with a smile. Their daughter, Lily Grace Blackwood, had come into the world 3 years earlier, bringing with her a joy neither of them had known was possible. She was a perfect blend of them, both Knox's blue eyes and stubborn chin, Tabitha's chestnut hair and quick mind. At 3, She was already a force to be reckoned with, curious about everything and afraid of nothing. Knox watched as Tabitha slipped from the bed and into her robe, admiring the graceful movements that still entranced him after all this time. Their life together had evolved into something more beautiful than he could have imagined on that fateful day when he volunteered to ride through a blizzard for medicine. The Sawyer place, now firmly, the Blackwood home had been transformed under their care. The house had been repaired and expanded, with a new kitchen and a nursery for Lily. The land had flourished as well, with a vegetable garden, fruit trees, and enough pasture for the small herd of horses Knox now raised and trained. Tabitha continued her medical practice in town, her reputation having grown to the point where people now came from neighboring communities to seek her care. Knox managed their land and his horse business, and together they had created a life of purpose and contentment. "What are your plans today?" Tabitha asked as they moved quietly down the hallway to check on their sleeping daughter. "Meeting with a potential buyer for that bay gelding," Knox replied, "and finishing the repairs on the west fence. You, Mrs. Peterson, is coming in for her rheumatism, and I need to check on the Baker twins. They've had a nasty cough." Tabitha paused at the door to Lily's room, opening it softly. Their daughter lay sprawled in her small bed, her dark curls a tangle around her face, one arm clutching the stuffed horse Knox had given her for her second birthday. She looked so peaceful, so perfect, that both parents simply stood watching her for a long moment. "I still can't believe she's ours," Tabitha whispered, leaning back against Knox's chest as his arms encircled her waist. "Best thing we ever did," Knox agreed, his voice equally soft. "Well, second best. Marrying you was the first." Tabitha turned in his arms, her green eyes meeting his blue ones. "Charmer," she accused with a smile. "Just honest," Knox countered, dropping a kiss on the tip of her nose. They closed Lily's door gently and made their way downstairs to the kitchen, where the morning routine of breakfast preparation began. It was a dance they had perfected over the years, Knox starting the coffee, while Tabitha prepared the batter for pancakes, their movements in sync without need for words. As they worked, Knox found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. From a solitary cowboy with no roots to a husband, father, and property owner with deep ties to a community. From a woman focused solely on her medical practice to a wife and mother who had expanded her heart without diminishing her passion for healing. They had grown together, faced challenges together, celebrated triumphs together. And through it all, the bond that had begun in that desperate ride through a blizzard had only strengthened and deepened. "What are you thinking about?" Tabitha asked, noticing his contemplative expression as she poured batter onto the hot griddle. "Us," Knox replied honestly. "How far we've come, how lucky I am." Tabitha's expression softened. "I was just thinking something similar this morning. About how one decision, your decision to ride to Silverton that day, changed everything." Knox moved to her side, wrapping an arm around her waist. "Best decision I ever made." "Even though you nearly froze to death," Tabitha teased, though there was a seriousness beneath her light tone. "Even then," Knox confirmed. "I'd do it again in a heartbeat, knowing what waited on the other side." They were interrupted by the patter of small feet on the stairs, followed by the appearance of a tousled-haired Lily, rubbing sleep from her eyes but already smiling. "Pancakes," she declared triumphantly, having identified the smell from the top of the stairs. Knox laughed, scooping his daughter into his arms. "Good morning to you too, little one." Lily planted a wet kiss on his cheek, then reached for her mother. "Morning, Mama. Morning, Papa." As Tabitha took their daughter, balancing her on one hip while flipping pancakes with her free hand, Knox was struck anew by the perfect completeness of his life. the home he had never thought to have, the family he had never dared to dream of, all of it stemming from that one moment of decision in a snowstorm. Later, after breakfast had been eaten and Tabitha had departed for her clinic in town, Knox stood on the porch of their home, watching as Lily played in the yard under the watchful eye of Mrs. Hollister, the kindly widow who helped care for her when both parents were working. The spring air was sweet with the scent of blooming flowers, the mountains in the distance still capped with snow despite the warmth of the season. It was a view Knox never tired of, a constant reminder of the beauty and power of the natural world and of his own place within it. As he turned to begin his day's work, Knox's thoughts returned to Theodore Murray, the man whose infection had set this whole story in motion. Theodore and Martha still lived in Copper Creek, their friendship with the Blackwoods having deepened over the years. They were like grandparents to Lily, who adored Martha's cookies and Theodore's whittled toys. Sometimes, when they all gathered for Sunday dinner or holiday celebrations, Theodore would retell the story of the blizzard, embellishing it a little more each time until Knox's ride took on nearly mythical proportions. Knox would protest the exaggerations, but secretly he enjoyed the telling, not for the portrayal of his own actions, but for the reminder of how precious and unexpected life's gifts could be. A horse's whinny from the barn pulled Knox from his reverie. Midnight, now retired from hard riding but still a valued member of the Blackwood household, was calling for his morning attention. The old horse had earned his rest and his place of honor, having carried Knox through that fateful blizzard and many adventures since. "Coming, old friend," Knox called, stepping off the porch and into the bright promise of another day in the life he had built with Tabitha, a life rich with love, purpose, and the deep satisfaction of having found, at last, the home he had always sought without knowing it. As he walked toward the barn, Knox glanced back at the house, at the smoke curling from the chimney, the curtains Tabitha had sewn fluttering in the windows, the small figure of his daughter playing in the yard, and felt a contentment so profound it bordered on reverence. The cowboy who had ridden through a blizzard had found much more than he had ever sought, not just shelter from the storm, but a place to belong, a woman to love, and a future bright with possibilities yet to unfold. It was, Knox reflected with a smile, the greatest journey of his life, and one that continued with each passing day. And in town, as Tabitha prepared her clinic for the day's patients, her thoughts too returned to that snowbound night 5 years earlier, when a stubborn cowboy had volunteered for what seemed an impossible task. How strange and wonderful, she thought, that the medicine he had brought back had saved not just Theodore Murray's life, but in a way, her own as well, bringing her a love and a family she had never dreamed possible. Life's most precious gifts, Tabitha had learned, often arrived in the most unexpected packages. And sometimes, the most enduring love stories began with a simple act of courage, a desperate journey through a storm, and a heart brave enough to welcome what waited on the other side.